because, as I said before, tortillas are consumed at very high levels in Mexico. In average, a Mexican consumes between half a kilo and a kilo of tortillas every day. So we consider that it's very, very important to keep tortillas and all the corn-derived food in Mexico free of GMOs and glyphosate. Of course, the residues that we found in tortillas were at levels that even in the US are not accepted to be found in food.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You just heard from Dr. María Elena Álvarez-Buylla, professor of molecular genetics at Mexico's National Autonomous University. Dr. Álvarez-Buylla was speaking about the high levels of glyphosate found in Mexican tortillas as a result of GM corn imports from the US. Today, we're sharing an interview with Timothy A. Wise, a researcher and writer, and an investigative reporter with US Right to Know, a public health group to expose corporate wrongdoings and environmental failures that threaten our environment and health. Tim is interviewing Dr. Álvarez-Buylla about the science behind the risks associated with herbicide-tolerant GM-modified corn and one of its associated herbicides, glyphosate. In her former role as the head of Mexico's National Science Agency, Dr. Álvarez-Buylla was charged with documenting evidence of the risks of glyphosate to human health and the environment, research that led to Mexico's precautionary policies to eliminate the use of GM corn in tortillas and to phase out the herbicide glyphosate. When the US government last year challenged those measures as unfair trade practices, her agency provided the science that the Mexican government used in its defense in the formal trade dispute, a process that is now awaiting a ruling by the 3-member panel of arbitrators. Let's listen to their important conversation.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Dr. Álvarez-Buylla.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Dr. Wise.
Well, since the Mexican government first announced its intentions to restrict GM corn cultivation and direct human consumption, and also to phase out the use of glyphosate, the US government has repeatedly stated that those policies have no scientific basis. The National Science Agency you directed was charged with documenting the science. Has Mexico answered the US challenge?
Well, yes, I think there's an ample documentation in the USMCA filings and in the dossier that we prepared. And these show very clearly the risks of GM corn planting, consumption in tortilla and masa. We have to remember that in Mexico, we consume almost directly much more corn than I think anywhere in the world, from half a kilo to a kilo a day. And there's also an associated risk due to the presence of glyphosate, and that was also amply documented.
In the trade dispute, I know Mexico invoked the precautionary principle, asserting that the burden of proof actually falls on the US to show that its GM corn with glyphosate residues poses no risk to Mexicans. As we await the decision from the USMCA dispute panel, why do you think it's appropriate to put the burden of proof on the US?
Well, in the first place, my own work in my laboratory has documented, together with many other labs, that once these GMOs are liberated to the environment, are used in agriculture, it's not possible to segregate them from non-GMO cultivars. And native varieties, which are thousands of them in Mexico, because Mexico is the center of origin and diversification, are at risk of accumulating these transgenes. And also the peasants who harvest and who cultivate these native varieties have the right to continue cultivating their varieties without these transgenes from the GMO crops. So for that reason, and because we have ample documentation now on the possible risks on health also, and the accumulation of glyphosate that is associated to the GMO crops in more than 80% of the lines, in the watersheds, in the soil, we have sufficient scientific evidence to call for a precautionary approach.
In light of the impressive scientific evidence the Mexican government presented, has the U.S. government responded by providing any of its own scientific proof that U.S. GM corn is safe for Mexicans to eat?
I don't think so. I think there was quite poor investigation from the U.S. part. The rebuttal did not have up-to-date scientific evidence, scientific annexes, really ignored many of the important studies, dismissing many independent science, because they continuously have cited science that it's also full of conflict of interest. And that's also a problem. It's very important not to ignore, which was largely what happened, the evidence on all the risks that have been published all over the world. And this was not the case in the filings from the US part.
I know the U.S. government repeatedly asserts that its own regulatory processes assure the safety of GM corn and glyphosate, and that should reassure Mexico. But why do Mexicans not trust that U.S. regulatory processes will protect them?
Yes, I think there's a very basic, erroneous, scientifically speaking, assumption on these type of statements. This so-called substantial equivalence has not been tested or proved scientifically. So what we are calling for is that the industries really prove that their GMO-derived food is safe. And there's now ample evidence. For example, among the US population, the amount of glyphosate that is being found in human fluids, in urine, for example, urine samples, is increasing. And there has also been found a very tight correlation between the levels of glyphosate found in people in the US and the risk of some diseases, for example, and many other types of evidence that have been ignored. And these recent studies, scientific studies, should be considered by the US part in order to challenge the substantial equivalence. So we are very interested in really introducing or incorporating all the research that has been done, not only the research that has been funded by the biotech industry, in order to really challenge the substantial equivalence. Because if substantial equivalence is not a valid, scientifically valid assumption, then the risk assessment that has been done in the US is not anymore scientifically well-founded.
The science agency, CONACYT's comprehensive review of the science of risks from GM corn and glyphosate was recently published. The dossier you talk about, 200 pages, more than 1,200 references. It is impressive and very important research that presents the case that you're talking about, and we're now getting it translated into English. Why did the science agency choose to publish the document now?
Well, This dossier that you're referring to was indeed the result of work done by many scientists in Mexico, not only the agency, the CONACYT, which is the head of the scientific research and humanities and technology in Mexico, but it was the result of many, many scientists. And during these 6 years, many of these scientists were coordinated by CONACYT in order to be able to get this information together. And it is very important to, and well, recently the new government also very interested in supporting decisions on science, has asked CBOGEM, which is the agency in charge of biosecurity, to make this dossier public.
And so it was published or released in the end of September, just before your term ended at CONACYT, and then published the next month.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And
yes.
And I know it's a lot to ask you to summarize, but what are the main categories of risks to human health that you feel like your research identified, that from GM corn and also from glyphosate residues, that should that justify the precautionary policies that Mexico has followed?
Well, yes, of course, I can name some examples. For example, the cases related to BT corn and to GI tract in mammals, which have not been adequately studied in humans. And also glyphosate-derived risks are not well documented either. But there are many lawsuits in the United States over non-Hodgkin's lymphoma associated to the exposure to glyphosate, and also other risks that have been associated. For example, this correlative work that has been done in the United States, correlating the levels of glyphosate found in the samples of American people and the probability of being sick, and all the other correlative work that has been done, which has found that since GMOs were massively released in the US, and people in the United States have been exposed to higher and higher levels of glyphosate, the risk of dying due to certain sickness, to certain diseases that are associated with chronic inflammation, have increased in a pattern that parallels the increase with glyphosate exposure. These are just some examples. Of course, the studies by Seralini in France, which were very well, they were questioned, and there were strong debates over them. Scientific debates have occurred, but we still need many more long-term studies in animals, of course, because we cannot do experiments. We should not be doing such experiments in humans, have to be done. And the president of Mexico, López Obrador, actually proposed the American government to collaborate in such long-term studies in animals. And the US government did not agree to pursue this.
Yeah, I know that your the dossier that CONACYT published is impressive for the detail and the array of different peer-reviewed studies in scientific journals, showing such a wide range of risks to human health and the environment from both BT corn and glyphosate residues, not just direct glyphosate exposure.
Yes.
Your own research, I know, has found was seminal in showing that the tortilla chain had been contaminated with both transgenes and glyphosate.
Yes, yes. In fact, that study was done in my laboratory before starting my position at the as general director of CONACYT. And indeed, unfortunately, we found that 90% of tortilla samples from several cities, not only Mexico cities, had some transgene fragment. We were able to amplify transgene sequences from different lines, transgenic lines. And we also found glyphosate residues in 1/3 of the samples that we studied then. Such studies have now been repeated, and despite the fact President López Obrador published a decree to avoid the use of transgenic maize associated with these glyphosate residues in tortillas and in other human food, we're still finding that some of these transgenic lines are being used for tortillas. And that's worrying because, as I said before, tortillas are consumed at very high levels in Mexico. In average, a Mexican consumes between half a kilo and a kilo of tortillas every day. So we consider that it's very, very important to keep tortillas and all the corn-derived food in Mexico free of GMOs and glyphosate. Of course, the residues that we found in tortillas were at levels that even in the US are not accepted to be found in food.
Yeah, that is indeed alarming. I know that the dossier, the scientific review, also highlights the risks to the environment and to biological diversity. I mean, what are the main areas of concern there?
Where there are many studies that have found the impact of GMO cultivars on diversity in general, also especially in lepidopterans, for example, in some types of butterflies, and in the flora and fauna, microflora, microfauna in the soil. And of course, the accumulation of glyphosate that was supposed to decay very rapidly, and is not the case in watersheds, in rivers, etc. And also, of course, the risk of transgene transgene flow into, as I mentioned before, into the native varieties. In Mexico, we have the obligation to keep this center of origin safe, not only for Mexican food production, but also for the world. It's a genetic reservoir that is very, very valuable. I can see in the back there, you have a sample of the diversity of maize varieties that we have in Mexico. And there are many studies that have documented, as I said before, that it is not possible to segregate the GMO cultivars from the non-GMO cultivars. So that's why in the decree that Mr. Ex-President of Mexico, López Obrador, signed or published, it is established that Mexico does not want to risk such diversity, and GMO maize should not be released into the environment of Mexico. And the means to avoid that transgene flow continues to occur from the corn that is imported from the United States that is not segregated should also be enforced.
I know that this week there were early indications from leaked sources that suggested that the Trade Tribunal on the ruling on the case on GM corn, on the GM corn restrictions is may well rule in favor of the US. President Sheinbaum has indicated that Mexico will seek other means to defend its GM corn restrictions. Why is Mexico so committed to these policies?
Well, Mexico is committed to these policies because, in the first place, corn is our basic food. Mexican food bases on corn, and so the possible impact of any risk associated to GMO corn could be very, very important in the Mexican population. Also because of food sovereignty and because of the also the better in terms of health, the quality, the better quality in terms of health of the Mexican maize varieties. So the government is very interested in promoting the cultivation and the use of Mexican maize varieties, and also in terms of conservation of these genetic varieties. It is very, very important to promote the cultivation, because the best way to preserve gene diversity is in the hands of the communities, of the peasant communities that are actively actually updating such diversity in terms of their adaptation to local environments in Mexico. So also in the face of climate change, we have also published several studies showing that Mexico will be able to lead to cope with increases in temperature and alterations of global climate if we have such diversity, rather than if we depend on the importation of corn that was originally devised not for human consumption, and even less for the diversity of culinary dishes and food and juices, not only in terms of food, but many other juices for which corn diversity in Mexico is very, very important.
I mean, by all accounts, the restrictions that that President López Obrador put on GM corn and glyphosate are very popular with Mexicans. And I've read that they even have the commitment of the tortilla industries themselves to keep GM corn out of their products. Do you think it's appropriate for the US government to use a trade agreement the way it's doing to try to end such policies when the current restrictions are so popular and don't really affect US exports very much?
Well, I don't think commercial trade agreements should intervene with the sovereignty of other countries. And I think the trade agreements themselves have statements that ensure that countries can be can assure their sovereignty in terms of important issues. And food is one of the most important issues, and keeping Mexican maize varieties free of GMOs and glyphosate free watersheds and food in Mexico has to do with our food system, and therefore with our health system. So I don't think there should be a conflict between trade agreements, or trade agreements should never be on top of the health and the environment of the countries that are involved. And this pertains not only to Mexico, but also to the US, because I'm sure that the US population is also concerned about the quality of their environment, their food, and their health. So that's my opinion on that.
No, I appreciate that. And I think we hope that all the wonderful research that you and your agency have done will better inform public policies in the US as well. I know, just to finish up, Mexico's Congress is now considering a constitutional amendment to ban cultivation of GM corn and its use in foods such as tortillas produced for direct human consumption. Why is that important?
Well, because the decree by ex-president López Obrador, it's very important and it's a strong instrument. But I think that if there's a constitutional change which enforces the protection of the Mexican main food, basic food, which is corn, that will be a long-term assurance in order to take care of our food system, our environment, and our health system. So that's why it's a priority for the Mexican government and the Mexican people to put this at the highest priority. And that is the reason why both ex-president López Obrador and now our president, Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum, are putting forward these reforms.
Dr. Álvarez-Buylla, thank you so much for speaking with us, and congratulations on an amazing tenure at CONACYT and a really valuable resource that you've provided to not just Mexico, but to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.